Greetings. My name is Omari, and I'm really excited to be here for the Phrase Your Flows presentation. Once again, my name is Omari, and I am the founder of Phrase Keywords. So, what I'm going to cover in today's training session, we're going to talk about some more advanced, or I should say, intermediate concepts. If you haven't watched the first episode, the first session, the first training module, make sure you go watch that because we covered what would be the basics, the fundamentals of flows, and the fundamentals of phrases. So, assuming you've watched that, we're going to pick up from that point and we're going to go into more intermediate concepts. So I'm excited to be here. Let's jump right into it. Wait. Before we get into that, I got to show you the shirt. Hold on. It's a new shirt. See that? It's a new shirt. It's similar to the last shirt, but this time he has shades on. Let me give you a closer view of that. There we go. He's controlling the bots, of course, but this time he has shades on. Why does he have shades on? Well, I wear this shirt and I wear these shades when I've completed the automation design and scripting and they're running smoothly. I put on this shirt and I wear these shades. And what does this mean? This means that I have succeeded in completing the mission. And now I can lean back and watch my bots run. Now, just as a reminder, when I talk about bots, when I talk about automation, I'm not talking about what scammers and hackers do when they're out there trying to, run up numbers on social media for videos and all types of things like that. Not talking about those types of bots. When I talk about automation, I'm talking about software testing. And when we talk about software testing, there's a lot of work that humans do not want to do. It's repetitive, like it's redundant, it's boring. We give those to the bots, but in order for the bots to do them, we have to program them. So again, we're talking about the good side of automation. That's the side I'm on, hanging out with my shades. When the work is done, I can lean back and my tests are running successfully. I'm excited. Drum roll, please. And I watch them run. And then we can use those tests over and over and over again to validate that our software is running properly. All right. Now that we got that out the way, let's get into the actual presentation. So once again, this is Phrase Your Flows intermediate level 30-minute training module. So what we're going to cover in this presentation, and we might go a little over 30 minutes, but hopefully we won't. But we're going to cover in this presentation, we're going to cover the data. We're going to cover the usage of tags. That should take about 15 minutes. And then we're going to cover the topic handling data using the PKD tool. If you've watched the previous video where we covered the PKD tool, then we're going to go into how we handle data. Next, we're going to get into organizing data in your TDH. I'll explain what a TDH is when we get to that. And then we're going to spend the last few minutes uh, talking about running TDH-driven tests in automation. So once again, you don't know what a TDH is yet. Just be patient. We'll get to that shortly. But let's start out with the data. So what is data? Well, when I talk about data, I'm talking about test flows, right? I'm talking about the stored values that are used to populate a screen, typically used to complete a form, and the data has to be something that's easy to reference anytime. So let's take a look at our previous phrase example and let's identify the data. The data in this case is easy to find because using phrase keywords format, we already have it encapsulated in the open and close brackets. So in this case, our data would be the website that we're going to, right? The name that we're going to use for the first name field, which is in this case, David, the last name, which is Smith. And that's pretty much the data. The submit is the name of the button. And that really isn't part of the data. But on line 5, we'll notice we're using David Smith as a tester when we're validating that we submitted the form successfully. So David Smith is a tester. We can also classify that as data as well. But when we validate this, you'll see through the usage of a more advanced feature of phrase keywords that we can put placeholders here instead of actually hard coding or putting a constant David in here. Like, what if we wanted to change it from David to something else like John Coltrane or Michael Jackson, right? Or Freddie Mercury, popular names in the entertainment world. But what if we wanted to just use those names as we're running this test flow? Well, if I hard coded David here, and if I just had Smith here, it'd be very difficult to constantly go into this test flow and change that. I'd have to manually do it every time. So what I want to introduce here is something known as the LP variable. Now, when I named it the LP variable long time ago, there's an underscore that follows the LP, so it's easy to identify, as you'll see in the next example. What LP stands for is local parameter or local placeholder. So when I say what is an LP variable, what I'm describing is a placeholder that is used for data. Excuse me for a second. And this placeholder, you'll see that I'm going to place it inside of my test flow. And what it's going to give me, it's going to allow me to use different values. Now, the key thing to remember here is that it only applies to this one test. That's what the L means, local. This one test only. So if I run another test flow later, I cannot expect my placeholder value for the last test to be applicable to the new test. The new test needs its own LP variables. And finally, it's used inside of the popular brackets that are part of the phrase keywords format. It's used inside of that. So let's look at our example, our phrase example that has been now slightly reformatted with LP variables. Now I'm going to point out for step 1 and step 2, these are new steps. Now we have 7 steps. And in the first step, we have LP underscore first name equals David. In the second step, we have LP underscore last name equals Smith. So what's happening here is we're making an assignment of the value David, which is our test data, and we're assigning it to this placeholder variable, aka the LP variable. So when we start moving it down our flow, you'll notice when we get to step 4, instead of having David here like the last time, let's just go back to the last time. We had David and Smith here. Well, now we have LP underscore first name and LP underscore last name. So you can clearly see how I've placed here the LP variable to act as a placeholder, and I made the assignment of David and Smith to that placeholder. That's what a variable is. Now, what I can do later on when I want to run the same test here, the same flow, but I want to use Michael Jackson, for example, I can just change David to Michael and Smith to Jackson. And I wouldn't have to change anything else on this particular test because the substitution would happen automatically. Now notice down here at step 7, I have the same thing as before, but I've replaced David Smith with the LP variable. So let's go back and look at it again. David Smith, and as you can see here, LP variables are in the same place. What's going to happen when we run this particular step, again, we're going to make the substitution because we're using the placeholder. We're going to know, for example, if I have Michael Jackson's name here, I know to place Michael Jackson as a tester. I hope that makes sense. We covered a lot in a very short period of time, but like I said in my previous training session, this is something that a 5th grade student can understand. So if you've got a high school diploma or higher, and especially as most QA professionals have, most testers have a college degree, this is very simple. This is not rocket science. You've used placeholders before, especially if you have any experience coding, and more than likely, if you're at the college level, you have. So, again, this is very simple stuff. Maybe a 6th grader, you know, 5th grade might be too low. Maybe a 6th or 7th grader would have to, that would be the minimum grade to understand this. But in coding, and you'll get a chance to see actual code in future more advanced presentations, you'll see the usage of variables. That word variable is very common in coding. So all I had to do is just call it a name. I called it LP variable many years ago, and I've been using it ever since. And I've used it on multiple different teams with people who aren't even technical, and they got the concept of a variable quite easily, as well as what the LP variable is and how it's used in a test flow. So no worries there. if this is your first time learning about phrase keywords, I'm confident that you can now go forward using and understanding what not only an LP variable is, but also what we're going to get into next, the test data harness. All right. Where is data stored? It is stored in the test data harness. What is a test data harness, you ask? I'm so glad you asked. The test data harness, or TDH, is where we store the data. It can be a CSV file or a JSON file. It can be a spreadsheet like Excel or Google. It can even be a relational database like Access, SQL Server, Oracle. The sky's the limit. But wherever we store the data in any of those types of files, we can store them locally on our machine or we can store them in the cloud. And we often refer to that location as the test data harness. So if you hear me say that from this point going forward, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And I usually don't say all those words, I just say the TDH for short. So let's see an example of a phrase that brings the TDH into play. And we have a popular phrase that's been standardized at phrasekeywords.com, and this is how it reads. Using the, and I call mine my TDH, test data source, load all LP variables assigned using test data ID, and in this case, we have an ID number. This is 1101. So there's two things I want to point out here because there are actually two parameters used in this phrase. You can tell which what the parameter is by the usage of the brackets. So if you see a word or group of words encapsulated in the bracket, that tells you this phrase is using one or more parameters. So in this case, the parameter is my TDH, and the second parameter is 1101. My TDH is a reference to the actual name of the test data source. So that could be any name, whatever you want to call your test data source, give it a nickname. This is not the physical location, although you can put the physical location in there, but it's not the physical location, it's the nickname you give to the test data source. Now, what happens is if someone wants to know where the test data source is, they can just ask or they can go to a reference location, usually published in the dashboard at a very visible place that says, this test data source, my TDH, is located, and then it shows the folder path. But at this level of the phrase, not necessary. You can just reference it by a nickname. Moving right along, the test data ID, notice in this case I put 1101. The idea here is that there will be a unique number assigned to a group or set of data. So I may have, in this case, in this case I have two data elements. I have first name and last name. Well, as you're going to see next, I'm going to reference the first name and last name many times with different rows of data so that I can have a row that has David Smith. I can have a row that has Michael Jackson, and other people that I'm going to use for my test, other names, right? So 1101 is a unique identifier that I'm using to reference that one row of data. So anytime you see this phrase at the beginning of a test, and that's where it should be. It should always be at the very top, step one, when you're using a test data source or test data harness in our case. Anytime you're using this phrase, it should be at step one, and it should tell you the name of the test data source, in this case, my TDH, and it should give you a unique identifier at the end of that phrase. So if you don't see the whole phrase, it's not in your view, and you want to know what the unique identifier is, you may have to click on the cell and scroll over, and then you'll see it. Okay? Very simple stuff. Now, what happens next is when this data is loaded from this phrase, let's go back a few. All right. Step one and step two. Notice here that we made a direct assignment. It's very visible. Step one and step two, where we have two LP variables, right? Well, when we actually load the data using the TDH, we don't have to do that step. We can just load the data and we can assume that the data is going to load successfully as LP first name and LP last name. So we no longer have to make that assignment at step one. We can just load the TDH, and that row will load, and all of those local parameters or LP variables will be available to all the subsequent steps in our test flow. So any step that is in our flow can reference any data that's in our TDH by using LP underscore and that data element's name. All right, moving right along. Let's jump into, before I take you into the TDH, we covered it a little bit. Let's just talk about another topic called a tag. What is a keyword tag? Now, this is going to be important because you're going to see a keyword tag in action. And if you don't know what it is, you're going to get confused. So I just want to pause here for a moment and just explain this to you before we get into the TDH. So a keyword tag, it uses two hashtags on opposite ends. So it's similar to the bracket, but it uses two hashtags on opposite ends. And it's a standardized, commonly used keyword, and it describes a changing value. And it's called tags for short. So if you hear me say use a tag there, what tags are you using? I'm referring to a keyword tag. So what does a keyword tag look like? Well, there are three popular, there are actually more than this in terms of common keyword tags, but in my opinion, this is the most popular that I've used on projects. You might use it and use other keyword tags. You can also create your own keyword tags. But the common keyword tags would be time, project settings, and login management. So when we talk about time management, so imagine you have a test flow and you want to always use today's date, or you want to always use the day um, in the future, such as tomorrow. Or maybe you have a test flow where you want to use yesterday's date, because in that case, you want to make sure error is displayed. But notice if you hard code a date into your flow, then as the days move on, that date's no longer going to be applicable. It's just going to expire, right? Because if every day you want to use today's date or tomorrow's date, well, as time moves, your computer's going to move with time. And so are your spreadsheets. And so when you want to run your flows against a website or an application, the website knows what today's date is as well. So you can't hard code a date inside of your test flow. This is where keyword tags come into play. So you're going to say today, and you're going to say tomorrow or yesterday. And there's many more keyword tags I could have listed here, like next year. You could also say like 6 months into the future. You can go into the past. Let's move on. I think you got that. What about project and environment settings? This is another useful use case for keyword tags. For example, you might want to know what the project's name when you're, outputting information for reporting purposes. You don't want to hard code that into your flow. Or you might want to use a specific output folder, but again, you don't want to output that into your flow. One common use is the TDH name itself. So if we're talking about um, creating a flow where I hard code the TDH name, what if someone comes along in the future and doesn't like that nickname and changes my TDH nickname to something else? I don't want to have to go to all of my tests that use that phrase and now correct the nickname. So this allows me to, as a keyword tag, use this as a reference. And then if someone changes the nickname in the future, it won't impact all of my flows. And then finally, when it comes to login management, is also very useful because let's say I'm in my test flow and I have a URL. Let's just go back to what we were looking at previously, where we had a URL, not that one, but this one. In step two, we have a URL here. Now imagine the URL name slightly changes. It changes from a .com to, let's say, a .org. The .com doesn't work anymore. Do I really want to go to all of my tests? Let's say I have 1,000 tests. Do I want to go to all of those tests just to change it from a .com to a .org? True story. This has actually happened. I remember working on a project. I was new to the project and the URL changed and they had hard coded all of the URLs in their test flows. And I was just like, oh my goodness, we're going to have to go to all of these URLs, excuse me, all of these test flows and make this small change to the URL for these test flows to work. They were feeding into automation and it was just a nightmare. We had to literally like break up the team into different groups and go in and make an edit. And I raised my hand and I said, "Excuse me, but why would we reproduce the same problem again? What if the URL changes again? We're gonna have to go in and repeat this. Why don't we just come up with a better way to capture the URL so that if it changes, we don't have to go back and manually fix it again?" And they said, "Well, what should we use, Omari?" I said, "We should use a keyword tag." And so that's what we ended up using. We ended up using the keyword tag. And I leaned back with my shades and I was just like, yeah, these bots are going to run perfectly now. It doesn't matter what they change. And the same is true for username and password. So a lot of times there's a login step in the flow and you have to use your username and your password. And what a lot of testers do is they actually put that information in the flow, which presents a few issues, right? Just from a security standpoint, passwords shouldn't be in the flows because the flows might be visible to a lot of people. So we may not want to put your personal password in a flow. What we want to do is we want to put the keyword tag in there, and then when the automated script runs or when we run it manually, the tester's instructed, use your password, use your username, or reference this particular secure file during runtime of the automation script. When the bots are actually running, they'll translate this in real time and extract the right username and password to log in with. So keyword tags are very useful for this reason. Time management is one of them. Project and environment settings is another. And of course, like I just mentioned, login management. All right, now that you have that understanding, we can get into the TDH. This is my favorite part of this presentation because now we're going to actually get into the spreadsheet where the data is stored. But before we get into that, I want to just show you what the phrase example looks like now that we are applying keyword tags. So as you can see here in step one, we have using the, and in the keyword tag, a TDH is there. And for the URL, instead of the hard-coded URL, we have hashtag URL hashtag, which is the keyword tag format. And notice it's inside of the bracket. All right. And it stands out. We usually bold that so that it stands out like any data element should. As you can see here, I have my TDH there. We're going to change that in the next exercise. So we finally made it to the exercise where we're going to handle data using the PKD tool. This is the exciting part of it. We're going to go to the PKD and we're going to take a look at the TDH inside of a Google Sheet. And just to rehash your memory, remember originally when we were using LP variables, the LP variable was making the assignment in the first step, and then we had the last name LP variable making the assignment of Smith in the second step. And in step 4 and step 5, they're acting as placeholders, right? All right. Well, what we're going to do now is we're going to go to the PKD. I'm going to get out of here. And in the PKD, I have a test that I created, which is basically a replication of what we just viewed. And as you notice here, I have my LP variables already in step 3 and step 4. I'm going to make a slight edit here to bring in my keyword tags, TDH, and I'm going to take out this URL and I'm going to say URL. All right. And I'm going to bold that so it stands out. So now I'm using the keyword tags and my test is ready for playback. So the TDH, where is it located? You would think it would be located in the PKD tool, but it is intentionally not located there. The concept of the TDH itself means that if we're going to have multiple testers creating flows and executing test cases, we do not want them having their own set of data separate from each other. We want the data to be centralized, standardized in one place that's easy to find and easy to protect. A lot of people make this mistake where they localize their data inside of their sheet. And then there's other testers that are repeating the same process, and you end up with all kinds of redundancy. That's not what we want when we're using phrase keywords. So I have a separate spreadsheet called my TDH. And this spreadsheet, again, it's a Google sheet. You don't have to commit to Google. You can use any type of spreadsheet technology. You can use Excel, for example. But in this case, I'm using Google. And it's the capabilities of Google being in the cloud make it so easy to share it with other members of my team. And once everybody has access, another cool thing about using it in the cloud is that it shows all of the users and it highlights what they're working on and what they're changing. So if I go in here, I can see what someone else is doing and they can see what I'm doing, and we don't clobber each other. Now, clobbering is possible. So if you see somebody in the TDH, what I recommend to make sure you don't clobber, just to be on the safe side, ask them how long they're going to be in the TDH and then wait for them to exit. That way you're in there by yourself. If anything happens, anything changes, you can easily look at the logs in Google Clouds and see what changed when, and you can fix it. You can identify who changed what. But as a process, I usually tell my testers only one at a time. But if you have to be in there, make sure you observe each other's sheet in colors to make sure that you're not clobbering each other. All right. So inside of the TDH, we have a column called the TDH ID. And this column stores the unique identifiers for each row that we reference from our test flow. So if we go to our test, we notice here that it has, and let me make this column a little bit smaller and make this a little bit bigger so we can see the whole phrase. There we go. And let's go ahead and bold this so it stands out. All right. So we have using test data ID 1001. This is referring to the row that has a TDH ID 1001. So when I run this particular test, manual or automated, we're going to use John as the first name and Coltrane as the last name, and we expect John Coltrane is a tester to display when we get to step 7. So in order to achieve this, I'm going to apply an LP variable in my test that matches this variable success message value. I'm going to place that in here to replace what I have hard coded in here, and voila. So now I have my LP variable there. This is going to be used instead of David Smith when I get to that last step. Now notice I don't have LP in here for the variable names. I could place it in here if I wanted to, but as just to not have too much redundancy, typically don't use LP inside of the TDH. But if it is used, now you know what it means. So you oftentimes will have to just translate that. When you see first name, when you actually look at the flow, there's going to be an LP where the value is supposed to appear. I hope that makes sense. And if you don't see an LP there, such as in the case of just first name for the edit box, I'm intentionally hard coding this here because the name of the edit box is never going to change. So it's only the data element that changes. Notice here for submit, I don't have an LP variable there because that button name is never going to change. So I'm only concerned about the data elements that I want to place in here as placeholders when I'm loading the data and using it. And I just want to reiterate here that this first phrase, using the TDH and the test data ID, is going to load the entire row of data as LP variables, and then any test step beneath step 1 will be able to use those variables simply by referencing them as LP underscore and their variable name. So a common question that I get here is, well, what if the variable is blank? What if you don't want to have a value for that variable, but it's inside of your flow? Well, I want to show you, and since you understand what keyword tags are, I want to show you a very popular keyword tag that's used for formatting variables called blank. So when you see blank, that means that the LP variable is not going to have a value at all. And there's an underlying rule here that if I run a flow and the LP variable is blank, then that entire step is going to be ignored. That's right, we're going to skip over that step. We're not going to populate or select anything on the screen for that particular form, field, or object. We're just going to ignore it, act like it's not there, and move on. So blank serves a very important purpose. I also use the keyword tag empty. So if you see blank or empty, means pretty much the same thing. It just means that variable is intentionally blank. All right, moving right along. We're making a lot of progress. I got my shades. I'm about ready to put them on for this particular training session. Let's go back to our presentation and let's see what's next. Running the TDH driven test in automation. Running TDH driven tests in automation. How does this play into automation? Well, using the TDH, you can use this approach with any automation tool. And just like in the prior presentation, the TDH can be executed in any automation tool that meets these two minimal requirements, right? Because the TDH in this case is in a spreadsheet. So it needs to be able to read a spreadsheet, excuse me, and it needs to be able to support custom library code. In this case, we would have custom library code in our automation that imports the TDH. Let's go back to the TDH. It imports the TDH, the specific row, into the automation. It loads these variables, these LP variables, and then the automation, the bots, apply this data when they're executing the flows. Does that make sense? So when the automation bots get to step 3 during that playback, the automation bots have already loaded the LP variables and they're going to substitute at runtime the value. What value do we have? John. So it's going to substitute John when it gets to step 2. And when it gets to step 4, excuse me, step 3. And when it gets to step 4, it's going to substitute Coltrane. Now, when the next automation bot runs, it could even run in parallel. And I could have that automation bot point to TDHID 1002 or 1003. Let's say I have it go to 1003. No, let's do 2. Let's give Queen some shine because we are the champions, my friend. Oh, you didn't know I could sing, huh? You had to wait for that. I gave you that at the closing part of the presentation. So when we get to this particular test identified by TDHID 1002, the automation bot is going to use Freddie and Mercury instead of John Coltrane. So we can create as many of these rows as we want, as many rows that Google can support. We can add 1,000. We can create all kinds of names. And then it will properly validate when it clicks the submit button that Freddie Mercury is a tester or Michael Jackson is a tester, right? Or John Coltrane is a tester. It'll validate that as a success message because that's what we're using as the last step in our test flow. So that's how the automation will execute from the TDH. As long as it knows where to find the data and which row to load based upon a unique identifier, which in our case is the TDH ID, as long as it knows how to access that data and get to that row using the custom code in our automation library, every bot can access the sheet oftentimes so fast, like it only takes a nanosecond to load the data. Well, a little bit more than a nanosecond, but maybe 10 nanoseconds. It loads the data so fast that the script starts running almost instantly as soon as you run the test, and it has all the data ready to go. So it's an excellent way to automate. You could do more advanced solutions, like I mentioned earlier, where you can use relational databases like Access or SQL Server, Oracle. There's a lot of solutions out there. I find this to be the most useful though, is Google Sheets or Excel, because when you're handling data like this, oftentimes you might have to change something across multiple rows at one time, and trying to change it using a query, you can do that like using a SQL query in a database. You can do that, but it can be a little cumbersome to access the database and then tweak data, with a query. But here's the thing, you can also tweak data in the spreadsheet using a query as well. Just write a macro and I can show you how to do that. Or the best way is you can just select a row or you can select the whole sheet and you can use Google Sheets find replace feature. So for example, if my username changed from, D Smith, and I'm referring to rows 8 through 10, D Smith 1, and it's no longer D Smith 1, it's now, David underscore Smith, 1. I can make that change very easily and just hit replace all. It tells me, how many instances it changed, done. And now my test is ready to go. I didn't have to access any database and do any queries and double check anything. It's visually right there in front of me. So for me, I prefer using Google Sheets and placing the TDH there. But if your project is scaled up and it's gotten significantly complex, where you have to have, a lot of data to run your end-to-end suite, then you might want to scale up to a relational database like Access or SQL Server or Oracle. It's really that simple. Of course, it's not that simple because then you have to know how to use a database. But I'll tell you something personal about me. When I was getting my hands wet in database management, this is what provided me the incentive to do that, because I was on a project and we had a ton of data. And at that early stage in my career, we didn't have Google. There was no Google Cloud, or excuse me, there was no Google Sheets, and you couldn't go into the cloud and use it. It was only Excel at the time and some other tools that were local to your machine, and it just didn't work managing data locally because we had too large of a testing team. So it made more sense to use a database, because that was the only way we could centralize the data and protect it and back it up. Whereas now, fast forward a few decades later, we have Google Clouds. So things got a lot easier from that perspective. But again, you may still want to use a database. That's up to you and your project. But because we have Google Cloud many decades later, it solved a lot of problems that I had to, solve with the database early in my career. And I've used this approach in many projects. Just in my last project, we used a pretty sophisticated Google Sheet. We actually had a few tabs in that sheet because we were managing over 100,000 rows of unique data, because we had over 100,000 rows of end-to-end permutations using phrase keywords. I'm not going to start bragging about that. That's another story. That's another highlight. What I want to do at this point is say, listen, thank you for joining me for this Fraser Flows using phrase keywords training session. I hope it was helpful. This was the intermediate level. We got into the data, we got into the tags, and we got into the TDH. What we're going to do next is we're going to get into more advanced concepts, but that's not for this session. We're going to close out this session. I'm going to put on my shades. I'm going to toss my football around, because we got the job done. And I hope you can get the job done as well on your end using phrase keywords. So, with that said, thank you for joining, and I'll see you in the next session, which again will be the advanced session. I can't wait to get into that, because this is a preview, just as a slight preview. We're going to get into some more advanced stuff in the PKD sheet itself. You can do more things than just write test flows. We're going to get into more creative applications. One of them is going to be creating a biography. We call that timeline playback. If you go to the phrase keyword site, you'll be able to check some of that out. Just click on creative uses. We're going to talk about user guidance as well, where you can use the PKD sheet to set up instructions for your user community, regardless if you're using software or you're doing things in the real world. It just makes it very easy to give people instructions. And then finally, we're going to get into storyboarding And the cool thing about storyboarding is that when it's time to create scenes, let's say you're working at Disney and you're trying to figure out, for the Marvel universe, what you want Thor to do next in the next scene. Well, you can actually visually hand draw Thor holding his hammer, or you can actually create that visual using phrase keywords, the PKD sheet, and you can just point and click, and you can use Thor holding the hammer. You can actually create Thor holding the hammer in your phrase keyword. And then, as you'll see, that can become a prompt into AI for then AI to create the actual illustration for your storyboard. So we're going to get into all of that. That's step 6 on the website, the creative uses of phrase keywords. There's just so much to get into, so many layers that it can be, excuse me, so many genres with multiple layers that it can be applicable for. And what you'll see here, and I'll close on this note, if you go to the PKD sheet and you go to settings, you're going to see here, step 4, that there's only one option here for tests. Well, when we get to the more advanced usage of this sheet, there's going to be an option for what you're seeing here: user guidance, timeline playback, and storyboarding. And then at that point, in that advanced training, we'll get more into that. So with that said, I want to thank you for joining this training session. It's been great, and I look forward to you reaching out to me if you need any help or you just want to get started with your own PKD tool implementation on your project. I'll be happy to help you. Just make sure you go to the contacts and you fill out this easy form. Just mention that you want to use the PKD sheet. You're ready to get started, and I'll be in touch either by phone or email to get you started using phrase keywords. With that said, I just want to say in closing, peace and love. Have a great day. Bye bye.